how I love folk tales. The hand-me-down stories parents tell to children across generations, and fairy tales are a big part of this oral history. When I was just a wee person, my favorite story was Cinderella. My dad would read me the story so often that I knew when to turn the pages before I could even read. Fairy tales often center on certain tropes, much like stories emerging from mythos, and exist with countless variations. I mean, if you've ever delved into the stories compiled by the Brothers Grimm or other early collections, the tales you know and love might be a little different than you remember. Perhaps a little more violent, not quite Disney material. So let's dive in. Folklore studies, also known as folkloristics, is the segment of anthropology departments dedicated to gathering and understanding these stories. This field of study started gaining its academic foothold in the 1950s, but a 1982 publication from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, titled Recommendation on the Safeguarding of Traditional Culture and Folklore, really helped shine a light on the importance of this legacy of storytelling. The United States Congress even went so far as to pass the American Folklife Preservation Act in 1976 that focuses on the expressive culture shared within various groups, be it familial, ethnic, occupational, religious, or regional. The act was created to protect the natural and cultural heritage as well as the cultural diversity of the United States. And I dig it. While new stories can be added to the mix of folklore, many stories have been handed down through generations of oral tradition. Think about the stories you might have heard growing up. Who was telling them? What was their purpose? Did you retell them the same way? For me, it was the story of La Llorona, or the disappearing ghost hitchhiker. And within my family, as with many other families, we've developed our own set of stories that get passed down. For example, every 4th of July, someone has to tell the story about that time my father, who was a deputy coroner for a small stretch of Illinois, went out on the Rock River to watch the fireworks display with my mother and the coroner and his wife. They were in a rowboat watching the show when there was a ground explosion and the fireworks stopped. Then, all of a sudden, both of their pagers went off. They had to row to the shore, leave the ladies in the boat so they could collect the unfortunate individual who incorrectly loaded a firework and lost his life and his head as a result. My dad used to tell this story, and now I tell it to my nephews every 4th of July. It's a family tradition. The ways in which folklore develops and gets handed down has always been a topic of interest to me. But more than all that, I love learning about how these stories have changed over time. Let's go back to the Cinderella story I loved so much as a child. My version was written down and then read to me out of a book with accompanying pictures. The Brothers Grimm included one variation of the story in their collection titled Aschenputtel, which is the German name for the Cinderella story. The basic structure of the story is servant girl marries prince, or more aptly put by Wikipedia, the word Cinderella has, by analogy, come to mean someone whose attributes are unrecognized, or someone who unexpectedly achieves recognition or success after a period of obscurity and neglect. The story of Rhodopis is often considered the earliest known version of Cinderella's tale. And I think it's fitting that this fable of Rhodopis was told long before it was ever written down in a compilation of stories by the Greek philosopher and historian Strabo. In this story, written during the early part of the 1st century of the Common Era, Rhodopis is a Greek slave who eventually marries the king of Egypt. Instead of fleeing a ball with little regard for the footwear she was leaving behind in her wake, an eagle stole a sandal from this Cinderella while she was bathing. The eagle flew to Memphis and just happened to drop the sandal into the lap of the king. He was enthralled by the beautiful shape of the sandal and the weird cosmic force that landed it in his lap. He sent out members of his court across the country to find the woman who had lost that sandal. That's about where the similarities end as we move forward in time. In an article by Joshua J. Mark published through the World History Encyclopedia, China had its own version told during the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907 CE. In this version, Ye Shen takes the Cinderella role. We also find an evil stepmother and stepsister who, quote, kill the animal friends of Ye Shen, but are ultimately destroyed when the girl marries her royal suitor. We then find the story in a 17th century collection from Italy by Giambattista Basile in his famous children's book Il Pentamerone, published in 1634, 2 years after the death of Basile. After that, French writer Charles Perrault tells another version in Histoire ou Conte du Temps Passé, his collection of fairy tales published in 1697. The Arabic classic collection of folklore titled 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights for most English speakers, as told by Scheherazade. There's even a bit of a Cinderella tale connected to Scheherazade's own story. In that tale, the king learns that his wife was unfaithful to him, kills her, and resolves to marry a virgin every day before beheading her the following morning so she doesn't have a chance to cheat on him. Eventually, of course, they ran out of noble virgins for the king to marry, but Scheherazade volunteers to be his wife. That first night, as the new wife of a murderous monster and monarch, she begins to tell him a story, but she stops in the middle as dawn is breaking. The king doesn't behead her later that day because, he's got to know what comes after the cliffhanger. Later that night, Scheherazade tells the end of one story before beginning the next one. Another cliffhanger and another day with her head still attached. So on and so forth until we get to the 1001 Nights. At that point, the king loves his storytelling wife and makes her his queen. No more death threats. Now, back to Cinderella. In the version of the story that comes to us by way of the Brothers Grimm, the stepsisters with, quote, black and ugly hearts, end quote, use a knife to try and make their feet fit in the dainty golden slipper, with one taking off a toe and the other one slicing off her heel. But the prince saw the blood from those injuries and knew they were frauds. The fun doesn't stop there. These sisters, sore of foot, decided to take part in the wedding festivities, hoping to gain favor with Cinderella, who arrives with a pigeon on each shoulder. The two shoulder pigeons peck out an eye from each of the sisters as the wedding procession goes by. And as the wedding party returns, the pigeons strike once again, stealing the other eye of the evil stepsisters. Now they're out of eyes, blinded for their wicked ways. Eyes get plucked out, toes get cut off, and cruelty abounds. Cinderella remains the emblem of kindness and love, but those birds on her shoulders certainly seem keen to do her dirty work. If she was so kind-hearted, maybe she would have stopped them from the attack, even if it was just the second one, or maybe she would stop giving him a lift on her shoulders. Anyway, everyone's a critic, I guess. Other changes to the story surround the fairy godmother, or lack thereof. In the Grimm tale, she goes to the graveyard and talks to a hazel tree. Sometimes the girl receives magical aid from her mother, who is either reincarnated or transformed into a cow. And the cow isn't even that uncommon, appearing in some Greek and Central Asian variations. When the mother appears as a cow, she's killed by the evil sisters. Maybe that makes the blinding more reasonable. An eye for a cow, but only if she's your mother. I don't know. In Perrault's Parisian telling, the fairy godmother appears. And just as the fairy godmother only appears in this version, the glass slipper also makes a unique appearance. The Brothers Grimm speak of a golden slipper. Some include shoes made from squirrel fur instead of glass or gold. That's right, I said squirrel fur. Not all Cinderellas get their happy ending either. Perhaps it's not surprising that in Scheherazade's version in 1001 Nights, the stepsisters use 12 magical hairpins to transform the newly minted princess into a dove on her wedding night. In the Russian or Finnish version that Andrew Lang included in his Red Fairy book, the stepmother manages to swap out a daughter for Cinderella, then turns our heroine into a reindeer. Yep, a reindeer. Please remember this version comes to us from the cold north of Russia and Finland. After the reindeer bit, this story really starts getting weird. The prince king husband tries to find a way to bring his wife back to him in human form. He has to burn the reindeer skin his wife casts off when she resumes human shape, except she's very modest and doesn't want to be seen naked. So she turns into a spinning wheel, amongst other things. And in this version, the evil stepmother and her daughter are tricked into jumping into a fire when Cinderella's husband covers the vat of fire and molten tar with a brown and blue cloth so it looks like a bath. Clearly. He then invites the pair to a nice, relaxing bath. They fall into the flames and tar, and the dying witch of a stepmother curses all mankind. As one does when they find themselves in hot tar. Andrew Lang churched it up a bit, allowing the stepmother and her daughter to live, but they were banished to live a nomadic life away from the comforts of the kingdom. There are so many different versions of fairy tales told all around the world, but the similarities often seem more astonishing. Joseph Campbell suggested that the repetition of archetypes and folktale formulas might be the result of a shared universal subconscious, or the psychic unity of mankind suggested by polymath and proto-anthropologist Adolphe Bastien. This psychic unity is a mental framework that all human beings share. This idea led Carl Jung to his notion of the collective unconscious. Now, you can look at this a couple different ways. The psychic unity might be the physiological mechanisms found in the human species, as Bastien suggests, while the collective unconscious has more of a mystical element, like maybe as humans, we all share some level of consciousness that we draw our mythologies from. There are a lot of layers we need to pull back in order to really explore the collective unconscious. So let's leave that for another day and jump back to our stories. Sleeping Beauty is another great example of a story that recent generations have probably heard a little differently from those earlier accounts. The 1959 Disney animation classic Sleeping Beauty tells the story of a princess named Aurora born in a happy kingdom. An evil fairy known as Maleficent, to be featured in more recent Disney films, curses the infant to die from the prick of a spinning wheel's needle. In this version, 3 friendly fairies are in attendance, and one of them alters the curse so the princess won't die by the spindle. Instead, she'll fall into a deep slumber until she wakes up to true love's kiss. Much better, right? A cinematic classic. However, variants that share similar cursed by evil magical creature to sleep for 100 years until awoken by a prince elements. Usually, it's a handsome prince. An early version of the tale called Perseforest, and if I'm pronouncing that wrong, please feel free to reach out, is a 14th century courtly romance. This time, the princess is named Zelandine. While the man she loves is off on an errand to prove his worth to Zelandine's father, the princess falls into a magical slumber. When Troilus, her prince, returns, he does not awaken her with a kiss. No, instead, he has sex with her unconscious body. In case you don't know, dear listeners, that's rape. The princess is now pregnant but still not conscious. Only when the child is born and able to extract from her finger the enchanted flax that roofied her does our princess wake up. To motherhood. Then Troilus returns to marry her. Ugh. Once again, the Italian poet Giambattista Basile has his own rendition, as do the Brothers Grimm and our dear Perrault. I'd like to point out that several versions include the physical violation by the prince, except for the Parisian Perrault and those Grimm fellas. In the French version, the prince is overwhelmed by the princess's beauty and falls to his knees. The spell is then broken and the princess wakes up, sees the prince, and chooses to bestow a kiss on him of her own free will. Much better, right? However, this French retelling does include the cooking of children for human consumption. Wait, did we get to that part? Yes, where the story that most of us know ends, there is a part two that is often left out of modern retellings. In fairness, some folklorists believe the Sleeping Beauty stories written over time were actually two stories that got combined into one during the centuries of oral transmission. For example, in the Grimm tale, our princess is named Rosamond, and her prince wakes her with a chaste kiss, and part two is left out entirely. But let's talk about this second half where we find out what happens to our princess after she wakes up. The Italian version, called Sun, Moon, and Talia from Basile's collection, places our young heroine in a noble countryside estate once she falls into her death-like slumber. The king is led by his falcon to find Talia, cursed to ongoing sleep when a cursed splinter of flax gets under her fingernail. The king is struck by her beauty, and when he isn't able to rouse her from her slumber, he decides to gather the first fruits of love from the maiden. Ugh. He then returns to his homeland while Talia gives birth to twins, a son and a daughter, while still asleep. The infant girl begins to suckle her mother's finger, for lack of a better option, and removes the cursed splinter of flax. Talia then wakes up and names the twins Sun and Moon, hence the title of our tale. Does it end there? No! The king comes back and finds Talia and his ill-begotten children. He falls in love once again, sure, but he also happens to be married. When his wife finds out about his other family, she forges a message requesting Talia bring the children to court. The queen orders the castle cook to kill, cook, and serve the children to the king, but the cook is like, whoa, whatever, and hides the kids, serving 2 lambs instead. The queen plans to burn Talia in a fire, but the king hears her screaming and discovers his wife's maniacal plan. Listen, I understand the trope of a woman shunned, but that should never lead to cannibalism, especially when children are involved. The king tosses his wife into the fire instead, along with her conspirators. Then he marries Talia, and the cook is rewarded for subverting the evil plans of the queen. The second half of Perrault's story is very similar, but it is revealed the prince has an ogre for a mother. When his father dies, the prince must assume the charge of king. He returns home with his bride and their 2 children. When the king goes off to fight in war, the ogre and dowager queen send Sleeping Beauty off to a hidden house in the woods and orders the cook to serve up the children. Ugh. Cook replaces kids with lambs, but the dowager queen discovers the trick and decides to throw the cook into, quote, a tub of vipers. Her son, the king, returns to court to find out what his mother's up to. The former queen then throws herself into the tub once her true nature is exposed. Everyone, except the ogre queen, lives happily ever after. The Norse Valkyrie Brunhild is often connected to the Sleeping Beauty stories, which makes sense, I suppose. Stories about Brunhild are found throughout Norse fables, and several have to do with these long naps. In one story, the legendary hero Sigurd receives a prophecy that he will awaken a sleeping Valkyrie who will teach him the runes. In a story after he faced Fafnir and drank the dragon's blood, Sigurd is able to understand the language of birds who tell him about the palace where a Valkyrie sleeps. This time, the sleepy heroine is identified as a different woman, but the bargain she strikes is the same as Brunhild from other stories. What bargain, you might ask? Both refuse to marry any man except for one without fear and end up falling into an extended sleep until that fearless man arrives. In the Old Norse saga called the Volsunga Saga, Odin uses a sleep thorn to punish the wily Brunhild and declares she must marry, but she's already sworn her oath that she will only marry a man without fear. Odin then places the sleeping woman on a mountain and surrounds her by a wall of shields until Sigurd awakens her. I think a lot of you would agree that none of these stories really have that magical romance attached to the versions we might have been told, but this is definitely a story in need of a modern rehashing. One with less rape, maybe more violence. I don't know, make it your own. I think that's the thing I like most about fairy tales or folk tales. Everyone everywhere can take the basic premise and weave their own story around the major plot points. Each new version reveals something of the storyteller and their place in the world. Sadly, I don't have any more time to share other stories, but maybe we'll return to this topic in future episodes. Why don't you let me know what you want to hear about, okay? Until we meet again, I wish you restful slumber for a reasonable amount of hours. Farewell, my lovelies.